On most late afternoons, a widowed farmer walked to the stone wall behind his barn, where a small tabby barn cat and a bottle-fed lamb shared the same flat rock. It was their quiet ritual after chores, 3 shapes resting above the grass. One breezy day the cat climbed up, then left a corner of the stone empty and would not cross it. He set his hand on that bare place and felt old grief rise with questions. The cat seemed to leave waiting. The last light of the day always slid along the old stone wall before it left the farm. It turned the lichen gold, caught the cracks where grass pushed through, and brushed the worn place where a man's elbow had rested for years. Eli Harper stood there as he always did, boots in the cool grass, listening to the fields settle. Most evenings, he told himself, he only came out to check the sky, to guess tomorrow's weather by the colour along the horizon. Still, his feet found the same path, his hand the same notch in the rock. The smooth dip in the centre of the wall nagged at him, as if something had been there so often it had carved its own small hollow. A tiny sound brushed the quiet, too soft to belong to the wind. It was a muted thump, like something light hopping up onto stone, then settling. Eli tipped his head, breath pausing, but the fields only hummed with crickets and a distant tractor on the road 2 miles down. He told himself it was nothing, just the old wall adjusting to the cool. Another night. A faint rasp came at the kitchen door just after supper. The sound of something testing wood with something harder than leaves. Eli froze with his hand on the sink, heart jumping once. Then he shook his head. A low branch, he decided. The farmhouse had always muttered to itself when the evenings turned damp. In the morning there were small marks on the thin dust near the step. They were no bigger than the tip of his thumb, neat and oval, paired like careful commas. He studied them a long moment, then snorted at himself. Stray tracks blew in from everywhere. This was a farm, not a hospital floor. Still, as he leaned on the wall later that day, a prickle ran up his arm. The air felt occupied. The hairs on his forearms stirred, though there was barely a breeze, and he found his fingers tightening on the stone. He could feel his own pulse in his palm, quick and foolish for a man with 70 winters behind him. One afternoon he left his old wool glove on the flat stone, too tired to slip it back on after fixing a hinge. When he returned from the barn at dusk, the glove had shifted. It sat near the centre of the slab, smoothed and pressed down, as if something had curled against it and then slipped away. Eli frowned, looking around the yard, but nothing moved except a sheet flapping on the line. On another evening, just as the sun sank, he caught a flicker of movement atop the wall. A low shape, small and compact, slid along the stones and dipped out of sight behind the big flat slab he called the sitting rock. He saw the suggestion of stripes, the lift of a tail, then nothing. His eyes, he told himself firmly, were as old as the rest of him. The sight tugged at the back of his mind until, with a slow, reluctant breath, he let himself remember. Years back, that same slab had been occupied every afternoon. Molly would rest her knitting there, and beside her, something warm and watchful would stretch in the sun, keeping one lazy eye on the yard. He had not talked aloud about those days since the funeral, but the memory came anyway. The small creature that had adopted their porch and never left, always choosing that same spot on the wall as if it had been built for it. Its quiet company had filled spaces words never could. After Molly was gone, the wall had stayed strangely empty. He came outside less. The seasons shuffled through snow, mud, haying, harvest without that familiar low shape to greet him at the stones. The silence there had become part of his loss, another room in the hollow house of grief. Now the sounds and moved objects and fleeting shapes were pressing against that old emptiness, and he couldn't quite ignore them. Something, or someone, was choosing the stone wall again. The thought loosened knots inside him and tightened others, all at once. As the light seeped out of the sky and the fields blurred into one dark sheet, Eli stayed by the wall longer than usual. Eyes narrowed. The soft thump came again, behind him this time, followed by a faint scrape along stone. He turned too late to see anything clearly, only the shadow slipping away toward the barn. His chest ached with a strange mix of hope and unease. Someone had made this place theirs again. He just didn't know who or why. The next afternoon, Eli listened for the sound almost against his will. The kitchen clock ticked through the late day. Dishes drying in the rack. Radio murmuring an old country song. When the last verse faded and the clock hands reached 4, he heard it. A light tap out by the wall, followed by a softer landing, as if something small had jumped and then settled. His fingers tingled as he crossed the yard. The short grass brushed his boots, and the breeze carried the faintest hint of hay and engine oil. On the flat stone, a few pale hairs clung to the rough surface, catching the sun like silver threads. He pinched one between thumb and finger, feeling how fine it was, how it curved slightly as if made to fit along a narrow, whiskered face. He told himself it could have blown there from anywhere. Maybe old sheepskin from the shed, or a scrap from a neighbour's dog that had wandered through. His mind, he scolded silently, had been playing tricks ever since Molly died, dressing every noise and shadow in old memories. That evening, as the horizon burned orange, he brought out a chipped saucer and set it on the stone wall. He filled it with a splash of milk more out of habit than belief, feeling a little foolish The wall looked back at him, still and ordinary. A crow called from the fence post, its harsh voice making him jump. Inside, he busied himself with sorting mail he'd let pile up, but a whisper of sound kept tapping at the edge of his hearing. A delicate clink, like ceramic nudged against rough stone. His skin cooled, and he paused, fingers resting on an unopened envelope. The farmhouse fridge hummed steadily, a bass note under everything. At last he walked to the window over the sink and eased 2 fingers under the curtain. The yard lay in copper light. On the wall, small ears rose above the stone, triangular and alert. A striped body crouched beside the saucer, one paw resting on the rim as a pink tongue flicked with quick, neat laps. His breath caught. The visitor was no stray shadow from the past, but a living thing, glossy and compact, with a white chest that shone in the dusk. When it finished, it lifted its head, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. Gold meeting faded blue, curiosity reflecting wariness. Then it dropped lightly from the wall and vanished along the base of the barn. He stepped back, hand pressed to his chest as if to steady the startled rhythm there. Just a barn hunter passing through, he muttered, hearing how thin his own voice sounded. It was nothing unusual, he argued with himself. Farms attracted all sorts of mousers. Yet the next afternoon, when the clock reached the same minute, the same soft clink sounded. When he looked out, there the visitor was again, perched neatly on the flat stone as if it had reserved a place. It drank, then settled with paws tucked under, staring toward the house with the patient stillness of something prepared to wait. The pattern repeated for days. The faint scratch at the door, the trail of fine hairs, the light weight landing on the wall at almost exactly 4 o'clock. Each time, Eli felt the same small chill along his arms, the same warm pull behind his ribs. Who had taught this little creature to keep a schedule? One evening, in a moment of impulse that surprised him, he opened the back door and stepped out slowly, hands loose at his sides. The animal on the wall turned its head but did not flee. Its tail curled once around its body, then uncurled. It watched him approach, eyes bright in the dimming light, as if measuring the distance not in feet but in trust. He stopped a few paces away, the stone cool under his palm. "You've picked yourself quite the throne," he said quietly. The visitor blinked, then lowered its head. Not submissive, simply accepting. A breeze lifted its fur in a small ripple. Eli stood there for a long moment, listening to their 2 breaths, theirs quick and steady, his slow and uneven mingling in the cooling air. The ritual had announced itself. Same time, same place, same low shape against the old stones. Still, the question lingered like a knot in the centre of his chest. Why this wall? And why him? Of all the yards in the county. Before it found the stone wall, the striped wanderer had passed through a patchwork of lives. It had been born in a cluttered tool shed at the edge of town, among rakes and paint cans and the sharp tang of gasoline. Its brothers had left early with children who shrieked and clapped. It had slunk deeper into the shadows, drawn more to quiet corners than busy hands. When the toolshed family moved away, the door was left ajar for weeks. The young hunter slipped outside one cool dawn, whiskers quivering at the flood of scents. Damp soil, fried dough from the morning diner, the electric hint of distant rain. No one came to call it back. The world beyond the yard stretched out like an unwritten story. It learned quickly which porches offered a friendly word and which only the thud of a boot. At one house, a retired teacher tossed it bits of ham from her sandwich, laughing at the way it pounced. At another, a teenager chased it with a broom, not hard enough to hurt, but enough that it kept to the hedges after that. The lesson settled deep. Some doors opened to comfort, others to disappointment. Winters were the hardest. Ice formed brittle lace along the edges of puddles, and its paws stung after every step. It tucked itself against the backs of warm engines and under sagging porches, shivering whenever the wind rushed through the slats. Once, after a night of freezing rain, it lay under a church ramp, listening to the choir practice above. Voices rising like warmth it could never quite reach. A spring storm sent sheets of water across the fields one year, driving it toward the cluster of buildings on the hill, Ellis Place, though it didn't know the name yet. The barn smelled of dry hay and old leather, a comforting mix. It squeezed through a gap in the boards and found a nest of burlap sacks where it could finally sleep without flinching at each gust. The steady breathing of the cows calmed its racing heart. For a while, it kept to that barn, hunting mice in the feed room and listening to the farmer's muffled footsteps above. The man's voice, talking to the cattle and to himself, carried an undertone of weariness, but no harsh bite. The animal watched him from rafters and dark corners, noting the slow, careful way he moved, as if every joint had something to say about the weather. On certain afternoons, the man would step outside and stand at the stone wall, his shoulders rounded, gaze fixed on a point far away. The wanderer saw him from the shadow of the open doorway, the sun making a thin crown along his thinning hair. Once, the man's face crumpled briefly, and his hand went to his chest as though steadying something invisible. Loneliness. The little hunter sensed, without words, could be as loud as any engine. It began circling closer to the house, nose lifting at the scent of frying onions, coffee, and laundry soap, as saucer, forgotten by someone years ago, lay under a lilac bush, half buried in dirt. The wanderer unearthed it with patient paws, nudging it onto the grass. Some habits, it seemed, lingered in a place long after the people who started them were gone. Yet trust was not something it offered lightly. Twice, when a passing truck backfired, it bolted for the safety of the hay bales, heart hammering. Another day, a visiting dog charged the yard, barking furiously. The striped hunter shot up a fence post and clung there, claws biting wood, until the farmer's sharp whistle sent the intruder away. Even then it waited a full hour before descending, every muscle trembling. So when it finally settled on the flat stone of the wall, choosing that spot as its daily seat, it did so with the caution of someone who had known both kindness and sudden noise. The stone was high enough to see the yard and close enough to dart back to the barn if needed. From there, it could watch the man's slow journeys in and out, study the slight lift of his shoulders when he noticed he was not alone. What the wanderer did not understand, at least not at first, was the weight the wall carried. It only knew that something in the man's gaze softened when it sat there, as if a missing piece had swung quietly back into place. That softness, warm and unfamiliar, tugged at the small, faithful heart that had once hidden under church ramps and behind trash cans. Trust, for both of them, would come only in careful steps. By the time their days settled into a rhythm milk in the saucer, paws on stone, a quiet greeting from the porch, the animal had already decided one thing. This farm, and this worn, grieving man, might just be the place where wandering could finally end. The morning the lamb arrived, the fog lay low in the pasture, hugging the ground like a memory that did not want to lift. Eli found the tiny creature tangled near the fence, shivering in the damp grass, its mother nowhere in sight. It bleated once, a thin, questioning sound that made his throat tighten. He wrapped it in his old canvas jacket and carried it to the barn, feeling how light it was, how its heart fluttered against his chest like a trapped bird. The striped hunter watched from the loft, eyes narrowed as the bundle passed underneath. The smell of milk and fear rose up together, sharp and irresistible. Eli mixed formula with hands that shook more than he liked to admit. He had bottle-fed calves before, but never something so small, so breakable. When the lamb finally latched and began to suckle, his shoulders sagged with relief. Warmth seeped into the barn like dawn easing into a long night. For days, he woke in the dark to feed it, each soft bleat drawing him from sleep. The little creature wobbled on unsteady legs, its ears too big for its head, nose damp and searching. The striped hunter stayed just out of reach, pacing along the beams, tail switching as it assessed this new arrival that stole so much of the man's attention. One late afternoon, after chores, Eli carried the lamb outside to feel the sun. Its legs had grown stronger. It kicked and twisted happily, nearly slipping from his grasp. He chuckled despite himself, the sound rusty in his own ears. As he lowered it onto the flat stone of the wall, the lamb folded its legs neatly under and settled with a sigh, as if the rock had always been meant as its throne. The striped hunter approached from the far end of the wall, paused silent on the stone. Its body was a ribbon of muscle and curiosity. Each step measured. It stopped a foot from the lamb, nose working, eyes bright. The lamb blinked back, unimpressed, chewing on nothing, its breath a faint cloud in the cooling air. Eli held his own breath, waiting for hissing or panic, for some small disaster he would have to untangle. Instead, the hunter simply lowered itself beside the lamb, paws tucked under, tail wrapped primly around its body. Their sides almost touched, stripes against wool, two small bodies outlined against the evening light. Something in Elis' chest gave way. The sight from where he stood by the gate looked almost like an old photograph he wished he still had. A shared seat on the wall, companionship arranged without anyone telling it how. The wind rose, carrying the faint jingle of a distant cowbell, and his eyes stung unexpectedly. From that day on, the pattern deepened. At 4 each afternoon, as the kitchen clock clicked past the hour, the hunter would appear on the wall first, claiming the stone with practiced ease. A few moments later, Eli would guide the lamb up the gentle ramp he had built, chuckling as it scrambled onto the slab and flopped down beside its striped companion. Neighbours who drove by slowed their trucks, smiling at the sight. "Looks like you've got yourself a pair of sentries," one called through the open window. Eli raised a hand in greeting, the motion toward the wall almost protective. The little tableau man, stone, fur, and wool became a quiet landmark on the road into town. Still, questions tugged at him when the house was dark and the radio off. Why had the hunter chosen his wall after so many wandering seasons? Why did the lamb press itself so trustingly against it, as if the stripes were just another kind of blanket? And why, when he saw them together, did he sometimes hear Molly's voice in his mind, amused and gentle, as if she had arranged the whole thing from some unseen porch? He didn't speak those questions aloud. Instead, he stood each day with one arm resting on the stone, feeling the warmth of the two small bodies at his side. Their breathing and occasional soft noises wove into the evening sounds of crickets and far-off machinery. The bond among the three of them, man, hunter, and lamb, was still new and fragile, but it carried the faint, steady beat of something that could last. By late summer, the ritual at the wall was as reliable as the mail truck. Ellis days shaped themselves around it. Chores done in time. Tools put away. Bottle prepared. Saucer rinsed and ready. At 4, he and the lamb would head toward the stone. The striped hunter already weaving between fence posts, like a shadow that had learned to stay. One Tuesday, the air felt wrong from the moment he woke. The sky held a yellow tint at the edges, and the wind came in sudden jerks instead of steady breaths. Weather reports on the crackling radio spoke of severe storms moving across the county. Heavy rain, possible flash floods in low areas. Eli glanced at the creek that cut through the back pasture and felt an old, buried worry stir. All day, the animals were restless. The cows shifted and lowed more than usual, and even the hunter paced tight circles in the barn loft. The lamb bleated whenever he stepped away. Tiny hooves drumming on the packed earth. Ellis' knees ached more than usual as pressure built in the air. Each twinge felt like a message from bones that remembered earlier storms. By mid-afternoon, the first thunderheads piled up in the west, thick and bruised. Lightning stitched faint lines behind them. Eli debated skipping their time at the wall, but habit and something stubborn in his chest pushed him outside with the lamb in his arms. The hunter trotted ahead, tail flicking, pausing once to look back as if to ask whether this was a good idea. They settled on the stone, wind tugging at Ellis' shirt. The lamb pressed close to its striped companion, ears twitching at each rumble. Eli stroked its back, eyes on the sky. Distant thunder rolled nearer. A low, continuous growl. He told himself they would stay only a few minutes, just long enough to keep the ritual intact. The rain arrived, like a curtain dropping. One moment the air was heavy but dry. The next, fat drops slapped the stone, then merged into sheets. Eli scooped up the lamb, calling to the hunter as he turned toward the house. The little predator hesitated on the wall, ears flattened, then leapt down to follow, fur slicking against its body in the sudden downpour. Halfway across the yard, Ellis' boots slid in the new mud. His bad knee buckled, and he went down hard, the lamb tumbling from his arms. Pain flared up his leg, bright and hot, and for a few crucial seconds he could not move. Rain hammered his face, blurring his vision. The lamb scrambled to its feet and bolted blindly toward the pasture fence. Panicked bleats, lost in the thunder. Wait, the word tore from his throat. Swallowed by the storm. He tried to stand and failed, leg refusing to bear weight. The hunter, soaked and wild-eyed, darted first toward the fleeing lamb, then back toward Eli, caught between two loyalties. Its fur clung in spikes, tail lashing at the stinging rain. With a sharp, desperate sound, the animal spun and chased after the lamb, its smaller body arrowing through the grass. Eli dragged himself to the porch, teeth clenched against the pain in his knee, heart pounding harder than it had in years. From the shelter of the steps he saw, through the sheets of water, the lamb vanished near the creek's edge, where the ground dipped treacherously. He reached for the railing, every muscle trembling. The creek, he knew, could swell in minutes during a storm like this, turning from a gentle ribbon into a brown, thrashing snake. If the lamb slipped in, there would be little he could do with his leg refusing him. Helplessness, thick and suffocating, pressed against his ribs. Lightning flashed, burning the scene in brief clarity. The empty stone wall behind him, glistening under the rain. The churned tracks where the lamb had run. The small striped form racing toward the low ground. Fear settled heavier than any weather. An old fear he recognized too well, the fear of losing something fragile and beloved while he stood, unable to reach. Chapter 6. What the Hunter Guarded. The storm battered the farm for what felt like hours, though the clock insisted it was less. Rain drilled the roof, and wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the panes shiver. Eli sat on the edge of his bed, with his leg wrapped in an old towel packed with ice, every thunderclap ringing through his bones. Between each rumble, he strained his ears for any sound from the yard. When the rain finally eased to a steady, weary drizzle, he couldn't wait any longer. Gripping a worn walking stick, he hobbled down the porch steps, each one a careful negotiation between pain and determination. The yard smelled of wet earth and crushed grass. Water still sheeted from the eaves, splashing against his boots. The creek had swollen, its usual quiet gurgle replaced by a rough, impatient rush. Grass along its banks lay flattened, and bits of debris spun in eddies near the fence. Ellis' breath hitched. He called the lamb's name, voice cracking, then repeated it louder, fighting the tremor in his throat. Only the creek answered, growling past as if late for some dark appointment downstream. Then, from beyond the bend where an old willow leaned over the water, a sound emerged. A sharp, insistent cry, higher than the lamb's usual bleat. It was punctuated by another sound, lower and rasping, like a hoarse shout in a language he didn't quite know. Eli followed, heart thudding, leaning heavily on his stick. He rounded the willow and stopped. On a narrow strip of muddy ground between the swollen creek and the fence, the lamb stood trembling, legs splayed, nose almost touching the churning water. One more startled step would send it over the crumbling edge. Between the lamb and the drop crouched the striped hunter. Its body formed a solid, quivering barrier, fur matted with rain and mud. It hissed and swatted each time the lamb tried to lurch forward, claws flashing just close enough to startle, not harm. Its ears were flattened, eyes huge, locked on the lamb with fierce concentration. At the sight of Eli, the lamb bleated, a ragged, relieved sound. The hunter flicked one ear but did not move aside. Instead, it pressed its body closer to the lamb's chest, literally blocking the path to danger. Its tail lashed, but its paws stayed dug into the slick ground, claws anchoring them both. Something inside Eli clicked into place with a clarity that stole his breath. This was why the animal had paced the barn that morning, why it had shadowed the lamb so closely all afternoon. The wall, their ritual, even the way it often placed itself between the lamb and the edge, all of it had been practice for this single, fragile lion it now held. "Easy now," he murmured, voice steadier than he felt. With painstaking care, he edged along the fence until he could reach the lamb's damp wall. He grabbed its scruff and hauled it backward, grunting as his injured knee screamed. The lamb stumbled, then collapsed against his leg, panting. The hunter finally retreated a few steps, sides heaving. Mud streaked its flanks, and one ear bore a small tear from some unseen scrape. It shook itself once, sending droplets flying, then sat down abruptly, as if the strength had gone out of its limbs now that the crisis had passed. Its gaze met Ellis, wide and unreadable, pupils blown like dark coins. "Thank you," Eli whispered. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He bent as far as his leg allowed and reached out a trembling hand. The hunter hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping forward and pressing its head firmly into his palm. Its purr rumbled up, low and steady, vibrating against his skin like a second, calmer heartbeat. He stood there in the damp, lamb leaning against one side, small striped body leaning into the other, all three of them breathing the same cool, post-storm air. The wall in the distance, empty and shining wet, seemed to watch them quietly. He understood then that the stone had never been just a convenient seat. It had been a training ground, a vantage point, a promise kept daily by a small, determined life. The realization loosened something that had held him rigid since Molly's last hospital stay. the belief that he was alone in keeping watch over fragile things. He was not. A quiet, whiskered sentinel had taken up the task beside him. Without ceremony or permission, as the clouds broke and a thin strip of blue appeared, Eli felt the strange, fierce knot of fear in his chest finally begin to untangle. Chapter 7. The Wall with 3 Places. Weeks turned into a new kind of ordinary. Ellis' knee healed slowly, leaving a stiffness that reminded him of the storm on cool mornings. The lamb grew sturdier, its legs longer, coat thicker. The striped hunter's ear healed into a tiny notch, a permanent mark that made it look, somehow, both fiercer and dearer. Their time at the wall resumed, but with a new weight behind it. Each afternoon, Eli walked a little more carefully, stick tapping the ground in a gentle rhythm. The lamb no longer needed to be carried. It trotted at his side, occasionally bumping his hip. The hunter hopped onto the wall ahead of them, pacing along the top before settling on the flat stone, checking the edges like a guard inspecting a familiar post. They filled the slab in a pattern that soon felt right. Hunter on the outer edge, lamb tucked against its side, Eli standing with one hand on the stone. Sometimes, on quieter days, he eased himself down to sit, grunting as his joints protested, and the hunter would shift to make space, tail brushing his leg like a casual assurance. The town took notice. The mail carrier began timing her route so she could pass by around 4, raising her phone to snap a quick picture. "Whole road looks better with you 3 on that wall," she called once. Eli just smiled, but inside, the words settled warm. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken of his place as if it brightened anything. Seasons edged forward. Late summer faded into early fall, the fields turning from bright green to a softer, dusty hue. The air smelled of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. On brisk days, Eli brought a warm blanket to drape over his lap as he sat on the stone, the rough weave scratching pleasantly against his palms. The hunter kneaded the fabric once before curling up, as if approving his choice. Sometimes, in the hush between wind gusts, Eli talked. He told them about Molly, how she used to rest her knitting right where the lamb now sprawled, how she had fussed over every animal that wandered near, whether it belonged to them or not. He spoke of the years when the wall had been empty, when he had avoided it because the quiet there sounded too much like an accusation. The 2 small listeners never interrupted. The lamb's jaw worked steadily, grinding hay, while the hunter's ears twitched in time with his voice. When he mentioned the day at the creek, his words stumbled, but he forced them out. The hunter's tail gave a single, slow thump against the stone, as if to say, "I was there. I remember." One chilly evening, as a thin frost formed along the grass, Eli realized something that made him chuckle softly. Without planning it, they had each claimed a spot on the stone. The hunter's place near the edge, the lamb's in the center, his at the corner where he could rest his back against the higher part of the wall. 3 spaces that fit together like pieces of a worn puzzle. The knowledge brought with it a fragile sense of safety. Here, at this particular slab of rock in this particular yard, they had woven a routine strong enough to hold back the worst of his loneliness. The world outside the farm still rushed and changed, but at 4 o'clock, there was always this fur, wool, stone, and the steady cadence of shared breathing. Occasionally, when clouds piled up on the horizon or the wind shifted strangely, shadows of old fear fluttered through him. His gaze would dart to the creek, then to the lamb's sturdy legs and the hunter's watchful eyes. Each time, the sight of them together on the wall, one careless, one vigilant, smoothed the worry back down. The wall, once a symbol of what he had lost, had become a narrow stage where his remaining treasures showed themselves, alive and stubborn. Chapter 8. The Meaning of the Empty Place. On an early spring afternoon, a year after the storm, the air carried that rare mix of chill and warmth that promised new grass. The lamb, no longer quite a lamb, nudged at Ellis' pocket as they walked toward the wall, searching for the treat it knew he often hid there. The hunter trotted beside them, whiskers twitching at the scent of thawing earth. At the stone slab, Eli paused, leaning more heavily than usual on his stick. His breath came shorter that day. He had been up late with an ache in his chest that was more annoyance than alarm. Still, habit drew him forward. The hunter hopped up to its place on the outer edge. The grown sheep scrambled onto the center of the rock and folded its legs under with practiced ease. Eli reached for his usual corner, then stopped. His body obeyed, but something inside him hesitated. He saw, suddenly, not just the wall as it was, but as it had been. Molly's knitting bag. The earlier barn companion who had once claimed the stone. The years when the slab had sat bare and accusing. Without entirely knowing why, he stayed standing that day, one hand on the stone and the other resting lightly on the sheep's back. He left his corner empty. The hunter glanced at the vacant spot, then at him, eyes narrowing slightly. The emptiness on the stone tugged at him. It wasn't the same raw ache Head felt after Molly's passing, nor the desperate fear at the swollen creek. It was gentler, threaded with understanding. An empty place could be absence. Yes, but it could also be invitation. A space left on purpose, in honor of someone who once filled it. He cleared his throat. You know, he said quietly, more to the ghosts than the animals. She always sat right there. His fingers brushed the bare corner of the stone, kept that spot warm every evening. Talked so much I hardly had to say a thing. The sheep huffed, and the hunter's tail curled around its paws, as if listening. For the first time, he let himself picture Molly not only as she had been in hospital rooms and framed photographs, but as part of this ritual. He imagined her leaning on the wall beside the two small creatures, hands moving as she spoke, laughter catching on the wind. The image settled in his chest without the old stab of pain. It felt astonishingly like company. From then on, he made a quiet choice. Most days, he left one place on the stone unoccupied. Sometimes it was his corner. Sometimes he sat and left the center bare, letting the hunter and sheep trade positions. Neighbors noticed once or twice and asked if one of his animals was missing. He just smiled and shook his head. No, he'd say, we're just saving a seat. The hunter seemed to understand in its own way. Often it would glance at the empty spot, then lift its gaze to the horizon for a long moment, tail tip flicking thoughtfully, before settling against the warm wool at its side. The sheep, content and solid, chewed its cud and leaned into the soft stripes, unconcerned by mysteries too big for its simple heart. Years layered gently over the farm. Ellis' hair thinned further. His hands grew more knotted, but the walk to the wall remained. Some afternoons he needed 2 stops to catch his breath. On others, he made it in one slow, determined stretch. Always, the stone awaited him, bearing the faint impressions of paws, hooves, and the ghost of a woman's hand. One evening, as the sun slid low and lit the edges of cloud in rose and gold, he stood watching his little pair on the wall, hunter and sheep, pressed close, the third space beside them open, ready. He felt, more than heard, the farmhouse behind him, the fields, the creek, the memory of a storm long past. Above all, he felt the quiet weight of gratitude for wandering lives that had chosen his gate, for a stone that had held so much, for love that had changed shape but not direction. He reached out and rested his palm on the empty place, fingers spread as if greeting an unseen hand. The hunter leaned into his wrist. The sheep exhaled a slow, contented breath. In that small circle of fur, wool, stone, and air, the past and present sat together without argument. The sun slipped away, and the first stars pricked the sky. Eli stayed until the chill told him it was time to go inside, then turned toward the house with with his companions at his heels. Behind them, the wall held their warmth a little longer. 3 places marked by presence, and one, always, kept open. Not as a wound anymore, but as a gentle, enduring welcome. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.